Morning, kids! This week, former BBC Newsnight journalist Emily Maitlis gave a speech where she laid out exactly what's wrong with how politics is discussed in the UK media. She gave several examples of BBC bias, like when her episode was removed simply because she reported that Dominic Cummings broke lockdown rules. Which is even more insane looking back now that we know that Downing Street was basically a rave den during the pandemic. And she even gave several examples of how she herself was guilty of what she called strategic bias, where journalists who report the objective truth get accused of bias when the truth makes something or someone look bad, and so they overcorrect by presenting viewpoints that are clearly objectively wrong just to look like they're being fair. So this week, I want to discuss the state of UK media, because the relationship between media and politics is what got us here. 200,000 people dead from COVID, the worst recession and inflation among advanced economies, and a relationship with the EU that even the people who wanted Brexit now don't like. We need to know what went wrong so that we can do better, and I want to give a personal perspective on this because Emily Maitlis is right.
Why should our viewers, our listeners, come to us to interpret and explain what's going on when they can see our own reluctance to do so?
Because it's the failure of UK media that created me and many others like me. Because when I speak to fellow activists, they almost all tell me they got involved with this because they could see that the traditional media conversation was missing something. Because I shouldn't be on your screen right now. It's no secret that Brexit is what gave me such a big platform. But why? Because when the EU referendum debate started in 2016, I was 400 miles away in Brussels. I barely knew anything about UK politics and I had 20 followers on Twitter. Now compare that with all the big news channels, the millions of followers they have on social media, the billions they have to spend on film crews, research, equipment, the access they have to interview and grill politicians. And between 2016 and 2019, they were covering Brexit 24/7. So people should have been able to get all the info they needed from there. So how did they drop the ball? Let's go back to February 2016 when Brexit was just kicking off. I was already pretty frustrated with the debate, a debate where immigration was a major topic. And Nigel Farage, the main man behind Brexit and the immigration issues related to it, said,
"There is nothing we can do to stop unlimited numbers of people from EU countries settling in this country and enjoying the same rights and privileges as all the rest of us."
Now that was a lie, and I got him to admit that it was a lie 1 year later.
Article 7 of the EU Citizens' Rights Directive, which says that in order to come here without a job, you need to have sufficient resources to not become a burden on the social assistance system of the host country and have comprehensive medical insurance.
Femi, in theory, you're right. In theory, under European treaties, there are restrictions that can be placed.
So the main argument of the main man behind Brexit was a lie that anybody who took even one module of EU law at uni could have told you. In fact, there's me out on the streets of Birmingham in June 2016 with a laminated printout of the law that proves it's a lie, and yet, can you remember that being part of the conversation? Because if everybody knew that under EU law you could only stay here for more than 3 months if you either had a job or you had your own health insurance and enough money that you're not considered a burden on the welfare state, and especially if they knew that EU citizens were twice as likely to be doctors as Brits, then the narrative that the EU was forcing uncontrolled migration that was clogging up our national health service would have died the moment they uttered it. And the conversation would have quickly switched to, well, do we need people to come here and work? And journalists could have then done the research and found that the NHS at the time was saying that Brexit would make the staffing crisis even worse. And they were right. And then we had a pandemic where our main weakness in keeping people alive was a lack of staff. But who was the main voice on the Remain side? A Conservative Prime Minister. And how likely was he to say, yeah, any complaints you have about immigration is down to me not using the EU's rules to control it. But that's kind of irrelevant anyway, because even though I've been promising to cut immigration numbers, foreigners have been basically propping up the National Health Service, which I've been underfunding for the last 6 years. So if you really want change, you want to vote the UK in and me and my party out. Somehow that didn't happen. So on the one side, you had Johnson and Farage telling clear lies about immigration. On the other side, you had a Prime Minister who would be hurting himself if he told the truth, and the Labour leader who's wanted us out of the EU since the 1970s. If neither side of a political debate is making the key points that are necessary to understand a topic, it is the media's job to fill that gap. Because at its core, the referendum debate was one side saying that Brexit would mean economic disaster, and the other side rejecting the idea that Brexit would make us poorer and saying they wanted control of our laws. But news presenters never really explained the link. Namely that it's the act of taking back control that would cause the economic damage. Because it's the fact that we now have a separate regulatory and customs system to the EU, that we now have to have regulatory and customs checks at the border between us and the EU, and it's precisely those checks that are crippling UK businesses by adding extra time and red tape. But to understand that link fully, you need to understand the single market. You know, that term you've heard a million times but was never really explained during the 4 years of Brexit chaos. Namely that if the EU didn't exist and you wanted to sell a product in all 28 countries, you'd have to comply with 28 different sets of rules, which would send your costs and prices through through the roof. So EU countries make rules together and accept products from each other without checks, which means that businesses only have one set of rules to follow, meaning we could sell to Barcelona as if we were selling to Barnsley. Now, as soon as you understand that, you can see that the very act of taking back control of our laws creates a trade barrier between us and the countries where we get a third of our food from, which is why arch-Brexiteer Jacob Rees-Mogg said that if we'd implemented Brexit fully this year as planned, then...
You were talking about 71% increase maximum level on the retail price. And frankly, at that level, goods just wouldn't have come in.
And yet, until October 2018, the official definition of the single market on the BBC website was a free market territory. So at best, maybe no tariffs. No mention at all of the shared rules that allow businesses to avoid expensive red tape. And you know why they corrected it? Because I told them to. I spotted it in October 2018, had a go at Laura Kuenssberg, and they changed it 2 days later. But that failure was damaging, because the main argument used by Brexiteers at the time was that we could get a simple free trade deal like Canada, and we wouldn't be any poorer. And if all the single market means is just a free trade area, which is what the BBC was telling people, then we could get all the benefits of that from outside of the EU and still take back control. So by giving a false definition, they were supporting the government's propaganda. But so much of it just comes down to journalistic cowardice, them being scared of giving people the objective truth for fear of being seen as biased. But reality does choose sides. Some things are just objectively incorrect. Like if tomorrow the government held a referendum on whether we should put bleach in baby food nationwide, would it be reasonable to bring one scientist on to say that's batshit insane, and the other to say, well, nobody's ever put bleach in baby food before, so all you've got is fear-mongering and predictions, supported by so-called experts who've been wrong in the past? No, because that is a very primitive understanding of the concept of balance. Because some journalists criticized Emily Maitlis, saying it's totally fine to have one expert on either side and just let the public decide who's right. But how? Unless you're an expert in a field, you can't judge experts. Think about how crazy that is. Say two neuroscientists are applying for the same job. Who do you think is doing the interview? Dave from accounting? Sure, Dave has a master's degree in business and accounting and he's great with numbers, but he's not a fucking brain surgeon. It is the responsibility of news channels to hire experts, get them to research the balance of expert opinion in a field, and give us content that reflects that. Because Brexit was a huge economic decision, and in 2016, 9 out of 10 economists were saying that Brexit would damage the country, and yet as Emily Maitlis said,
it might take our producers 5 minutes to find 60 economists who feared Brexit and 5 hours to find a sole economic voice who espoused it. But by the time we went on air, we simply had one of each. We presented this unequal effort to our audience as if it was balance.
A public service broadcaster should be giving the public an accurate reflection of the expertise, and if only 10% of economists say that Brexit will be good, but you show them 50% of the time, that means the public is seeing the minority opinion 5 times more than they should. That is false equivalence. And for me, the most painful false equivalence was on age, because I put my life on hold for 2 years to be the chief spokesperson for the youth movement against Brexit, Our Future, Our Choice. Now, I've got to be blunt and a little bit harsh. Look at that graph. We all know the end result was very close, so I think we can all agree that if you just look at the people who are below the age of retirement, we are a Remain voting country, which means that the people who actually have to work and raise families in the economy that Brexit creates voted not to have to do that. And yet when news channels wanted to discuss that issue, I was repeatedly put up against some 22-year-old Brexiteer giving the impression that young people were evenly split on Brexit 50-50, even though that demographic voted 75% Remain. And in the BBC's Under 30s Question Time episode, which took place 1 week before the election, making it the last chance to show older voters that they risk condemning their kids and grandkids to a future that we didn't want, they made the audience 50-50. Actually, no, they skewed it in favour of Brexit because the BBC website said that they picked the audience to make it reflect the referendum result for all ages. The only reason you'd have a special episode for under 30s is to show the views of under 30s. That's what people would expect when tuning in. Because if that age group is 70-30 against Brexit, then the purpose of that episode should be to find out why. Why does our generation reject Nigel Farage and everything he stands for? And not choose an audience where half of them were clapping him. Because in this, the BBC deliberately used young faces to broadcast the views of an older generation, which can only be described as deliberate disinformation. I mean, seriously, what is this?
As I say, the majority of you voted for Brexit in this. We select this audience very carefully to be representative.
And even now we've left the EU, the principle of objective truth is still missing. In her speech, Emily Maitlis attacks the media's silence over the damage that Brexit is doing. Because the Tories are still trying to renegotiate the Brexit deal that they spent 3 years on, and yet journalists don't even push back at all when Tories pat themselves on the back for supposedly getting Brexit done. Meanwhile, Labour has almost completely refused to talk about Brexit since the election for fear of being called Remoaners. And so, as I said before, because neither party is saying what needs to be said, the media won't either. It's the job of news presenters to report the reality of the situation and call out the politicians who try to hide from it. Interviews should not be safe spaces for people who cause this much damage, especially when they tore apart British society for 3 years to get there. As I said, just because neither Labour or the Conservatives are saying it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because the worst example is the failure to recognise that Brexit is obviously about international relations. The fact that our politicians decided to frame it as a binary issue, leave, remain, doesn't make it one. Are there only 2 possible relationships between the UK and the 27 countries of the EU? No. And are there people who voted against the old one happy with the new one? No. But did you ever hear a single news presenter say that Brexit can't be democratic if the 52% don't agree that the new relationship with the EU is better than the old one? Because both Labour and the Tories kept calling it a democratic referendum, so the news presenters copied them, despite the fact that the constant infighting between Brexiteers made it very clear that it was impossible to please them all. And so here we are, with a Brexit that all 3 pro-Brexit parties do not want, which is damaging our economy during a cost of living crisis because the UK media failed to present critical parts of the discussion. Because as Emily Maitlis says,
every day that we sidestep these issues with glaring omissions feels like a conspiracy against the British people. We are pushing the public further away.
And that's why so many new outlets for news and political commentary have sprung up over the last few years. And to be honest, it's kind of inspiring, the fact that so many people have chosen to grab the wheel because they could see the country veering off course. And that so many people have recognized that traditional news was failing us until they found better sources of information, which is what has allowed creators like Peter Stefanovich, Super Tansky, Dr. Sholomoshibamu, Mike Galsworthy, and the absolute army of Gen Zs on TikTok to become what we are today. Because yeah, sure, the people who've always been inclined towards the far right will flock towards fascist FM, but they've always been the minority, and the new generations are demanding better. Have a great week.